Hicks. I am the Director of International Programs with Students for Liberty, and I'm so excited to be joined by Turi Munthe, who is an absolutely incredible gentleman who is the founder of Parlia, which we'll be diving into. But he has a really incredible background that I just want to highlight very quickly. He's the founder of Demotix, which became the world's largest network of photojournalists. He also was a publisher, a journalist, an author, and a talking head and political analyst, mostly on the Middle East, which we did not get a chance to talk about, but it's also a big passion area of mine, so we need to talk about that at some point. And also serves on a handful of nonprofit boards focused on media. So I'm very excited to have him here today to talk about how the internet shapes our opinions. So welcome, Turi. Thank you so much for being here.
Liz, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So as you guys heard, we are going to be talking about how the internet shapes our opinions. And this is, in my opinion, a very exciting topic to discuss today, especially in today's climate, both politically and just socially, and how we're all interacting with each other. So right off the bat, though, I want to talk to you, Turi, about Parlia. If you could tell us a little bit more about it. So, why did you create it and how exactly does it work?
Thank you so much. So I've been interested in free speech forever. My whole career, I've been on the board of the oldest free speech magazine in Europe called Index on Censorship, which was trying to help Soviet dissidents in the 1970s. I've been on the board of something called OpenDemocracy, which is a giant pluralist website trying to build these things out. Because I profoundly believe in the marketplace of ideas and believe that it's through talking rather than through beating each other over the head with sticks that we actually advance this glorious thing called democracy. Cut to 2016. 2016 in the UK is the year of the Brexit referendum. 2016 in the US is the year of the first Trump v Hillary election. And what hit me like a bolt between the eyes on the back of both those events was the glorious, perhaps not, but at least peaceful consensus politics that we'd lived with since the end of the Cold War was definitively shot. Basta, over, ruined. It may have been shot a long time earlier. I think there was huge fallout from 2008, which we just didn't see expressed across the political landscape until 2016. But actually, when we hit 2016 and these things emerged, it was perfectly visible that, in fact, there were deep, deep fractures across our societies, and that we kind of been ignoring them all this time. So because I'm mildly psychotic, my reaction to this was not, okay, let's figure out how we negotiate this new political reality. My reaction was, but how can we actually help each other to bridge those gaps? How do we build something which can really bridge those gaps, which are now properly extreme? But also, there is actually not that much that we're arguing about. So this is the great surprise, right? With Brexit, which for your listeners who thankfully, and I bless them and I'm jealous of them, don't know what Brexit is, it was this very, very deep social and political cleavage which took place across the UK about whether or not to stay in the European Union, which we'd been in for 30 years, had a fractious relationship with, but was very committed to, and the European Union was committed to us. So this debate as to whether we were going to stay inside a political union with our biggest trading partner or not, obviously super important, super polarizing and complex decision to take. But actually, after 6 months of arguing with people at all sides of the political spectrum here, I realized there are like 3 arguments to remain, and there are 3 broad arguments to leave. And we are wasting so much breath going over these things over and over again. There must have been billions of words spilt about Brexit. And yet there were 3-4 reasons to remain, 3-4 reasons to exit. Ditto with the Trump-Hillary election. There were 3-4 reasons that people voted for Trump and 3-4 reasons that people voted for Hillary Clinton. And yet, this giant machine of content and argument and fights and screaming across lunches and Christmas dinners and everything else. So was there a way? What hit me was, if there is a limited number of opinion about something as complex as the US election or as complex as Brexit, is that the case with everything? And it turns out it's true. It is. There is, how many opinions are there on abortion? The most polarizing topic around. You're either pro or against, or you're going to have a discussion as to when life starts. Does God exist? Yes, no, we can't tell. 3 opinions. Is the hot dog a sandwich? Much the most important question I've flagged so far. Should white people have dreadlocks? All these things, there are 2 or 3 opinions on each side. And again, back to my sort of deeply hidden but nevertheless present psychosis, my view was, if there's a limited number of opinions about everything, let's catalog them. Can we build the definitive catalog of all opinions about everything? Can we build an encyclopedia of ideas? And that's Parlia. So that's Parlia. We're trying to build a giant project, which is design one around cataloging everything that the world thinks, like a huge sort of oral project. We want everybody to come onto the site and tell us what they think about things, because we're like mapping the true glorious breadth of human opinion in 2020. We also think that it can do wonders for civil discourse, because and we'll talk about polarization, I hope, slightly later. But one of the things that we've seen is that it's very difficult to listen to the opinion of somebody who disagrees with you when they're shouting at you. I've just described Twitter. And so what Parlia is trying to do is, in a calm, dispassionate way, describe the opinions, not scream them, but describe them, with a view that hopefully you, Liz, who are convinced that Rafael Nadal is the greatest tennis player of all time, and me, Turi Munthe, who is convinced that Serena Williams is the greatest tennis player of all time, could actually come and understand each other's perspectives, still disagree, but accept that the other person is still human in the process. So that's the objective of Parlia, to build this giant encyclopedia of thought, to help fix civil discourse, and to really bring everybody in. So we're a collaborative project. And what I hope your listeners will do, our viewers will do, is go to parlia.com, PARLIA.com, sign up and begin contributing to this wiki. We're a wiki for opinion, to help map what the world thinks.
Absolutely. And that's so cool, because I think what you're doing is so important. Like you said, people aren't talking to each other, we're starting to just scream at each other. And I think what really needs to start happening is seeking to understand. And I really do hope our viewers go to Parlia, sign up, and start documenting your opinions on there, so we can showcase to everyone else, where we're coming from with our points of view, and ultimately seeking to understand one another, so we can start talking to each other again and not just at each other. But that does bring me into one of the things that you highlighted that I want to move into next, which is polarization. And specifically, we've seen so much growth and increase in polarization over these last few years. I think it's always existed to some extent, but it seems so much more noticeable now than ever before. So why do you think this is, and where do you think polarization ultimately stems from?
Ooh, what a great question. So if you don't mind, I want to back up a tiny bit, because actually polarization is a tricky idea. And it's, most people who look at polarization break it into 2 distinct bits. So polarization is this idea that we're pulled apart across a line, across a spectrum, towards a north and a south, or a left and a right pole. But actually it happens in 2 ways. And those are called, on the one hand, political polarization, and on the other, belief polarization. So political polarization is simply the distance between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and Labour, left and right. It's how far apart are we on key policy decisions. Big government, small government, abortion, not abortion, etc., etc. That's political polarization. And actually, we've been way more polarized in the past than we are today. Think of the 1970s. The 1970s, you had a strong, very old-fashioned post-war conservatism that was broadly not tremendously ignore gay rights. They were still pretty misogynistic at the time, progressive, socially extremely conservative, a sort of a hangover from the pre-war times on the right. On the left, you had everybody smoking tremendous amounts of fantastic weed, and going off on demonstrations against the war, living in love communes. That is truly polarized. That is, from a political perspective, very, very polarized. So that's not what's happened now. What we've seen on the political front today in the US, UK, Germany, France, across Western Europe, is a different form of political polarization. And what the polarization that we see now is actually more one in which all our opinions are not tremendously far apart, but we are completely distinct from each other. So even in the 70s, You could be a hippie with a beautiful orange flower power shirt and still kind of believe in the free market, say. So you could have, though, most people had opinions which sort of ranged across a variety of different things. You could be a conservative who was pro-choice. What we're seeing today is that actually, in terms of political polarization, if you're a Democrat on everything. If you're a conservative on everything. There is very little bleed between those positions. And that's problematic for a series of reasons, but that's one form of polarization. The second form of polarization is what's called belief polarization. And this is way more dangerous because what belief polarization looks at is the views that we have of the other side, regardless of how close or distant we are from our politics. So you and I very, very strongly disagree on Rafa Nadal and Serena Williams. That is political polarization. Belief polarization is when we both think that the other person isn't just wrong, but somehow intellectually corrupt, morally inept, because she thinks that Rafael Nadal is the greatest tennis player of all time. That has shot through the roof in the last 10, 20 years. And actually, there's a spectacular organization in the US called the Pew Research Organization, which has done very deep work on polarization in the US with all sorts of ramifications for the UK and other parts of Europe too. And this is what they focus on because that's where things get messy. That's when you dehumanize the other side. Sorry, this is a very long rambling answer to your question, but I realize I've only half answered it because that piece is what is polarization?
Which is important.
Which is important to plow through. But your other question was, and where does it come from? Right?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. So at all points interrupt me, would you, Liz? I have a tendency to ramble. So yeah. So please do just press beep and I'll stop and we'll change tack. But just to answer that question as to where polarization comes from, I'm fascinated by it because it sort of ranges from the sublime to the ridiculous.
Right.
So from literally the sublime. I'll come to that last because it's most interesting. So obvious reasons. The media, mainstream media, cable TV does a tremendously bad job for us here. Fox News and MSNBC were founded within 4 months of each other in 1996. Both of them realizing that there was a lot of money to be made from sitting very much in one far corner of the political spectrum and sort of augmenting it and driving it and pushing it harder. Mm-hmm. So it's created a kind of a camp. They created hard camps, tribalistic camps over there. That's not great. Social media, Facebook, Twitter, the West, even worse. They too figured out that actually what really drives traffic and therefore really monetizes is emotion. So why would anybody be there trying to negotiate an in-between between multiple different opposing sides? No, throw more wood on that fire because the more head up people get, the more time they spend on those platforms. So media and the economics of media today play a really big role in this. What else?
Something I definitely want to get into later is media and the role media is playing in polarization and, how they're prioritizing, what they're focusing on now. Is it focusing more on getting true facts out there? Is it focused more on getting ratings and being bombastic? But that's something we can dive in a little bit later. Tell us else where polarization comes from, please.
So I'm just two more interesting little reasons for polarization. Geographic mobility. So we all now move for our work. It's always been the case in the US, but it's massively accelerated. And it's now the case pretty much everywhere. There's far, far, far more geographic mobility than there ever has been. So what does that mean? 30 years ago, you could be on the left or on the right. And in your neighborhood, you would find pretty much all shades of the political spectrum because people were born, brought up, stayed, died in the same places roughly. So there was real mix there. What happens when people can move, and everybody is super mobile, is that they tend to gravitate to spaces which resemble them. So today, depending on where you live, the likelihood that your best friend who you go bowling with or play tennis with on the weekend is of a different political stripe to you is really low, which means we don't kind of meet people from opposite sides of the political spectrum, which helps to reinforce our views. And the last point, which I think it's fascinating because it talks to how deep this thing is. One other very widely attested reason for this polarization, this politicization of everything, is actually because we believe in God a lot less. So when I said from the sublime to the ridiculous, that was what I meant. 30 years ago, around the world, religiosity was up tremendously. In the US particularly, right? It was this great outlier amongst the developed nations where, the vast majority of US citizens really truly believe in God. No longer. The US is like 12th least religious country in the world now. A massive change in the way people understand the role of God and religious identity for themselves. What does that mean? Big hole in one's identity. When you lose God, what are you going to replace with real meaning, real purpose? And it turns out, for better or worse, that actually a huge number of people have decided politics was going to fill that role. The morality of politics was going to fill that role. So when before you used to say, I am an Episcopalian or a Catholic or a Jew or a Muslim, now people are much more likely to say, I'm a liberal, I'm a progressive, I'm a conservative, I'm a Tea Partier, whatever it happens to be. Sorry for the very, very long answer, but there's a series of reasons why polarization has accelerated in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, it's so interesting though, because I feel like when people do declare, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, or, people like me, I'm a libertarian, then it seems like it is almost their way of indicating to others, these are my moral beliefs. These are the things that I cherish. And these are the things that, I hold to the highest standard of when you break it all down. But I'm curious to hear about, as we shifted into a more virtual world, obviously, when the internet was created and blew up, that opened up a whole new world of possibilities, but especially with social media in general, how has shifting into a more virtual world made polarization even more prominent?
We've already touched on it slightly, but social media is not just a platform, they're businesses. And they have business incentives, and you've already flagged them, which is that more traffic and more time is spent on social platforms when people are engaging emotionally rather than people engaging intellectually. It's obvious, and we all function that way. And so what has happened here has been that the social platforms themselves are incentivized to run with content which is more, their word would be engaging, another word would be emotional. In other words, would be triggering, possibly left or right. So the fundamental economics of the internet do not favor calm, dispassionate 18th century discourse, the kind of discourse which John Stuart Mill, in his famous book about liberty, that is the classic defense of free speech. His imagining of what free speech looked like was, let's be honest, a bunch of suited men in high shirt collars and black cravats having quite sententious conversations with each other in a drawing room somewhere with a glass of port. He did not imagine people flinging the vilest kind of abuse that you can come up with across Twitter. There's a fundamental distinction.
It's really interesting. I mean, one thing that you brought up and that we kind of touched on earlier, is social media. They're private companies, and even just media that's online now, or even just through, regular news, it seems like the stories that they're highlighting, have an emotional spin and are used to obviously bring attention to their channel and what they're showcasing. Do you think there are any news sources out there that are truly unbiased? Or do you think at this point, there's any way you slice it, there's going to be some spin on it?
This is one of the fundamental problems with the neologism of fake news, and specifically its implementation by political parties all over the world. I'm not just talking about Donald Trump, obviously, who made it sort of his trademark clarion call, and a very damaging one in my view as well. There are facts. We profoundly believe in facts. We have to believe in facts. I'm sure all our viewers believe in facts. We are not relativists, but there's always been perspective. And one of the things that smart, informed readers of news do is try and get a sense of what those perspectives are. And we've done this forever, long before the internet. Long before the internet, the really educated would try and read 2-3 newspapers a day. To try and get a sense of how things work. We've all had this experience. No, when you're a slight expert in something, none of the news that you read about it feels accurate. I spent 10 years working on the Middle East, and every single newspaper that I read of every political stripe basically got it wrong, and I knew they got it wrong because it's news. It's coming in on the day. It needs to be turned around super fast. They're going to get it wrong. So it's always been an approximative exercise. What we have to, and there's always been an element of perspective around the news. But this, I think, is the key piece. We have to be working with media organizations. We have to be engaging and reading media organizations where the journalists themselves are in good faith. They are trying to get to the truth. They value the idea of facts. And that, I think, that's where you find your news. And it's not going to be accurate forever, but in aggregate, you'll get somewhere close to the truth. Just to talk to this question of fake news and why it's so dangerous.
Yeah, please.
It's a misnomer. What it does is it takes this phenomenon that has always existed, which is the fact that there is an element of perspective around all telling of a story. We know this from Chinese whispers. We know this from multiple witnesses talking about the same event. There are people with the best intentions in the world, and a true commitment to the idea of fact and truth, will nevertheless tell different stories around it. What the idea of fake news has done is to massively overhype the fact that there is perspective associated with facts or perspective associated with storytelling. The reason that this is so damaging is not because one or other can throw the slander of fake news at one media organization or another. It's much deeper than that. The cancer of this term fake news is not that it's used as an insult, is that actually it plays straight into the oldest and most effective tool of actually Soviet propaganda, which is sort of disinformatia. And disinformatia is not about sowing mistruths, telling lies and bleeding them into public consciousness. Actually, its job is just to make everybody believe that nothing that they can read is true, that they have to suspect everything. And the reason that's so damaging is it destroys any possible sense of a reality consensus. And if you and I, arguing about the best tennis player of all time, can't really be sure that Rafa Nadal really ever existed or Serena Williams wasn't in fact a cyborg, because people have been telling us that everything is fake. Right. If we don't have that, then there's no basis of argument. We all live in these horrible dystopian subjective information hells with no way of bridging to other people. That's what's so dangerous about the idea of fake news.
I totally agree. I mean, we were talking, just a couple of weeks ago, and it's right during when all of the U.S. election, all of the states were getting called or starting to get called a bit. And it's interesting because when I was watching that coverage of the election, I would look at Fox News and I'd jump to CNN, and I would just keep hopping around in hopes of finding some shred of truth in the middle. If I created some complex Venn diagram of what everyone said, would I find the truth in the middle? That's so challenging, though, as a viewer for, how do we know what we're being told is fact versus opinion? And it sounds like such a silly question because we would assume that it'd be easy to tell. But I think now it's getting more challenging for us to determine what is actual fact and what is, just a spin or an opinion, or, we also heard about alternative facts being a thing as well. So I think that's one of the challenges, is how do we hold media accountable, perhaps, or even how do we just determine what is true and what is fact, or is it not entirely possible without just shifting through all the different information that we're getting?
I mean, you're sort of asking me to articulate a way of identifying truth from falsehood. My beard isn't long enough, unfortunately. If I had a staff and a cape, then I was truly a prophet. No, I think that we're all in the process of constantly negotiating the information ecosystem, and we do it to the best of our abilities. And actually, there are we've always known this, right? There are advantages in being writer, and there is no right, there is just writer. And people who work in the stock market are constantly chasing that element of truth because it'll actually make a massive difference to their returns if they can catch a fact before other people. But while I don't think that we should be thinking of the media in that way at all, because I think that what we want is truth disseminated as broadly as possible because it's fundamental to democracy. It's always been incumbent upon us. It's not just Yes, of course, one can regulate the media. Yes, of course, one can get stuck in and try and halt a whole series of really terrible malpractices. But it's also up to us. It's also up to us.
Absolutely. It kind of brings me into this next line of thinking, though, is, free speech, like you said, it's so important, and especially freedom of press and being able to get different opinions and points of view and just showcasing everything that's happening out there is of the utmost importance to us. But do you think when you look at free speech and then you look at honest speech, do you think they should be held to the same levels of importance? Do you think one is more valuable than the other?
So let me just be clear. By honest speech, you mean speech which is sincere. Is that what you mean?
Mm-hmm. That is factually accurate, is true and sincere.
Okay. So I'll say something very banal. I think one should certainly privilege truth over rubbish. No question at all. And I think that all conceptions of free speech are really articulated around this core idea of authenticity, of sincerity. So when, going back to John Stuart Mill in his pipe-smoked filled study somewhere in early 19th century English countryside, his sense of what free speech was, his core fundamental defense of free speech, was between committed, sincere adults, all engaged in a common project to find truth, or to come up with the best policy decisions, or whatever it is. And so just a couple of things there. One, it assumes sincerity and authenticity is at the very heart of the project. To your point about honest speech. It doesn't have to be true, it doesn't have to be right, but it has to be conceived of as true. It has to be believed to be true. Mm-hmm. But the other key piece here is this idea of being engaged in a common project. And this, I think, is exactly what polarization mitigates against. So you and I sincerely believing in absolutely opposite things about tennis players can nevertheless come together if we accept, one, a little bit the terms of debate. So we both promise not to hit each other. We can maybe get a little bit testy, maybe even a bit angry, but we're not going to hit each other. We're safe in each other's presence. Mm-hmm. We're also both profoundly committed to getting to the bottom of it. So there is, one, you need authenticity, honesty, sincerity. Two, you need to be committed to that common project, because if not, there's no reason for me not to, in internet parlance, to gaslight you, to troll you, to play you, and you to do the same thing to me, because we're not actually engaged in this thing together. This is an idea that I adore in the context of democracy. Sorry, I'm in England. All my metaphors are English.
That's all right.
But there is this another beautiful 18th century idea which emerges out of the British parliamentary system, which is the idea of the loyal opposition. The loyal opposition is fundamental to democracy, like it's fundamental to free speech and the process and the importance of free speech, because what it says is the most valuable person in my environment, if I'm trying to get to the truth, is the person on the other side. Because if they're engaged in the common project of building greater democracy, coming with the best policy decisions, figuring out whether empirically this or that is true, then their disagreement with me will force me to sharpen my arguments. It'll force me to be more imaginative in the way that I'm thinking. They're a fundamental part of the empirical process, and they're a fundamental part of the democratic process. That's what being on the same team, sharing the same project is all about.
When we were meeting a couple of weeks ago, we figured out that we had a mutual interest in Jonathan Haidt. And what you just said really kind of reminds me of the TED Talk that he delivered, it's probably a few years ago at least. But what he has said is that it's almost as though we're living within this moral matrix, and that we've been divided into teams really based on how we value certain beliefs or ideals. So he also offers, to red pill his audience. I'd like to offer to red pill our audience as well, all of our viewers here, in this moral matrix, and to offer solutions how we can see past, this moral matrix that we're perhaps living within. But could you elaborate more on this idea of how we value certain beliefs over others and how that has created this dichotomy amongst us?
Such a good question, and so much to unpack there. So
Go for it.
No. So and please write me when my hovercraft goes off course.
Sure.
So Jonathan Haidt, for those of you who don't know, Jonathan Haidt is a moral psychologist whose fundamental belief was that shared by most scientists, is that we don't just evolve as individuals, we can also evolve as a group. So his idea here is that the cultures that we have ended up with, America, China, Saudi Arabia, Malawi, India, etc., are evolved, and therefore that there is in a sense, there's a fundamental value in all the various different political stripes, because they all play into this shared project of our culture, our political culture. High level, without conservatives, an entirely liberal culture would have been annihilated, because they're so open to experience, they are so not interested in defense, they are so excited by other people, that they would have been massacred by the first conservative tribe they'd have come across, who would have big spears and big rocks and all those other things. But a purely conservative culture would plausibly have been would have dwindled to nothing, because as soon as the rains failed wherever they were, they'd have been so terrified of what lurked around the corner, so unopen to experience, that they'd have starved to death. So actually, cultures need a little bit of everything. So that's his sort of starting point from a political perspective. But what he does is he then maps all of us on a moral spectrum, and he has 5. Remind me if I get these wrong. He has 5 core. What are they? They're like modules that the human has, and those moral modules are. Liz, help me. Justice, so our interest in justice, protection from harm, loyalty, authority, and sacredness or purity. Right. Mm. And so Jonathan Haidt's view is that broadly, for progressives, they really, really value protection from harm. They really want to stop people being hurt, and they really, really value justice. So those are the 2 key drivers for liberals. And conservatives really value those things, but they also really value the 3 others. They also really value authority. They really value the notion of loyalty, and they really value the idea of sacredness or purity. And so this is this core realization of John Haidt's, and his moral foundations theory, which is this idea, is now contested in several ways, but it's a really fascinating foundation to think about how we spread across what the things which are most important to us. The reason that I like it so much, amongst the many different moral theories out there, is that what it does is it reminds us that our opinions about Rafa Nadal and Serena Williams, but also about slightly less trivial things like whether we should have big government or small government, whether human life begins at conception, whatever it might be, really things of massive import which people go to war over. Those opinions are derivative of a profound moral sense. So that they're not the starting point. They're not the cause. They're the result of a further back cause, which is how we map across a moral spectrum. And that's fascinating. And one of the reasons that I find it so important, to go back to your red pill idea, how do we get over hating the other side of a debate, and really hating as polarization, as we were just talking about, really where we really are now. And I think the way we get over it is by reminding ourselves that everybody's commitment to their ideas, to their opinions, are as morally grounded as our own. Mm-hmm. Suddenly it renders one, it explains a whole lot why we're so angry about these things, because they come from deep in our core. Right. But 2, it reminds us that the person on the other side is making exactly the same ethical and moral commitment that we are. They're just doing it from a different perspective. There's one example that I think makes this so patently clear, because it's such a brutal one. Yeah. Children in cages. The cause célèbre of liberals during the over this whole Trump period. Mm-hmm. A policy also which in many ways predates Trump too. So there's putting it clearly into perspective. Liberals go bonkers over this. Why? Because their key moral foundation is protection from harm. And what they see is innocent babies split from their parents and kept in cages on the border. their very fiber screeches against this. Conservatives, and I'm blanketing and generalizing in a hideous kind of ways, but conservatives, the reason that conservatives are much, much happier with the children in cages in the border is because their instinct is one towards loyalty. That loyalty piece is all around protecting kin. So right. Conservatives have, across every metric and statistic, much more interested in protecting their close circle than the wider abstract whole. That's all about loyalty. And therefore for them, their view is that again, I'm generalizing, is that it's the parents, the terrifying parents of this foreign culture who are prepared to put their children in harm's way to come and attack Americans like those conservatives. So what they're doing, that profound moral instinct, is to protect their families. Once you can see that you're triggering the deepest moral code in a human, as in the opposite side's DNA, and you realize that they're coming at this from exactly the same reasons as you are, there's a chance you hear them out.
Absolutely. One thing I find interesting though too is this doesn't just apply in, you know, the US or North America or even Europe. I mean, they did studies on how people value or how they weight these different values, and it was the same across the board for in every continent, every area of the world. And so I think that is what is so fascinating about this too, is, you know, I feel like once you can understand that, you know, we're all, I think most of us, 99 at least, hopefully % of us, want to see a better world. We just disagree on how we get from A to B because we value things differently. I mean, myself as a very proud libertarian, when I talk to people who believe in very socialist ideas, I mean, I don't think they're wrong for that, but when I ask them why they believe in that, it's because we ultimately have the same goal. We want to help people. We just value things differently in how we want to achieve that. That's something that I found so interesting is, you know, it is just like this across the board. So how do we red pill the audience? How do we get them to break out of this moral dichotomy and hopefully help reduce the amount of polarization that we see amongst us?
If I knew, I mean, everybody should sign up to Parlia and help build out this encyclopedia of opinion, which hopefully will become a sort of a building block in civil discourse. So one, shameless plug. Two, people have suggested all sorts of things, from doing less politics, peculiarly, being involved in less political things, going off and you know sports in teams with people who you haven't picked because of their politics, engaged in various different activities which take the sting out of politics, which allow you to realize the humanity of other sides. Others have suggested that what we need is we need common projects. We need common projects. It turns out that COVID, peculiarly, is a common project. And actually, COVID, while there's obviously, of course, polarization around COVID, mask, not mask, lockdown, not lockdown, there is some polarization there. Actually, across the world, most people are mostly in support of their government responses. There's some big counterexamples to that, but most people have been in support of their government policies there. And there's something peculiar at work here, because those government policies differ all over the place. It's actually really the fact that government has come in and decided to take a stand for the community, for society. It's sort of built society. It's reminded us that society exists again. You don't go out, not because coronavirus is going to have any particular health impact on you. You're young and you're just not in that demographic, but you're not going out because somebody else who you don't know, hundreds of people that you don't know, are potentially at risk. What that's done is it's sort of knitted together this notion of a fabric of society. So actually common projects do a whole bunch of good things. And then my sincerest hope actually for to fix the polarization is we just need some really frightening aliens. If we have really frightening aliens, then, and they start peering down at us from on high and we see them out there, then the whole of the human race will turn around and go, oh my goodness, these guys are way more frightening than you who are a liberal or a progressive, or you who are a libertarian, or you who are a conservative, or you who are brown or Jewish or whatever it might be. So yeah, I want some paper aliens, because that'll bring us all together like a rash.
Yeah, that's what we need. You know, we just need some weird like extraterrestrial moment right now to just help us get a reset button and
exactly
start working together again. But yeah, that'd be great. Rooting for that a little bit.
Slightly trite point, but I think what I'm also trying to what I'm trying to say there is that actually the difficult thing about humans is that opponents bring us together, perhaps more than anything else. So actually, Britain has never felt more British than during the Blitz when it was being bombed by the Germans in the Second World War. Why? Because we had a common enemy, and that does wonders to paper over internal cracks. And actually, to the point about polarization that you asked originally, why is it there? One of the reasons is possibly because of the end of the Cold War. You know, for 70 years, the West, but also actually the East, so communist countries and capitalist countries, had a really screamingly dangerous enemy. So actually that brings huge cohesion internally, whether you're in the communist bloc or whether you're in the free market bloc. That's gone. So actually, one of the things we have to get over is this profoundly dangerous piece of human nature, which is that what brings us together more than anything else is hating on other people.
Right. I think COVID is a really interesting example of that, though, because in some sense, we have seen people come together to work on this, but we've also seen it just get so politicized. And so I feel like that kind of goes back to, you know, where polarization comes from in a sense. I mean, it definitely covers the political part of it, but also the belief side. I think it's just even the idea of COVID and the responses to it has become so polarized and politicized that, you know, it seems challenging to move past, but I think we can. I think it does provide a unique opportunity for us as a human race to come together and move forward in a way that's going to be meaningful for us in our future.
That's right. I think COVID is sort of a Rorschach test, because we've got very limited data, but we've got very limited proven data, but vast amounts of data floating out there. And therefore it's the sort of perfect play pit for people to be able to pick and mix and choose and everything else. And if you want an academic to say X, you'll find them. And if you want an academic to say opposite of X, you'll find them too. So we're in one of those weird spaces where actually what you hear from people's approaches to COVID, you hear their politics, you hear their morality far more than the depths of their scientific research peculiarly. There's a very strong reason that people obsessed with freedom would find masks deeply problematic,
right,
and would find government lockdowns forcing people into curfews. It would terrify them, and that's a sincere terror. It's got very little to do with whether masks actually work or not. It's more just a libertarian tendency, for example, right? But you'd also, but you can make exactly the same case for the super pro lockdowners who wanted everybody shut down, who wanted, because it was because everything was going to be impacted in the same way, et cetera, et cetera. That protection from harm instinct that you get from liberals overrode any of the science and any of the economics as well. This is one of the fundamental things, which is the left would close everything down because there's one person who might die. I'm massively oversimplifying, but that tendency is there, and is far happier to give up on the conversations around counting the economic costs, for example.
Yeah. So just to make it clear to our viewers, how do we dig ourselves out of this weird polarized hole we found ourselves in? You know, moving forward, what are some actionable items that we can give and provide to our viewers here on how to just handle or even potentially mitigate the amount of division that we see? We talked a lot about online, so we can start there. You know, when we see it online, we see so many Facebook arguments, so many, you know, trollings on Twitter, or all of that that's happening. How can we online start talking to each other again? What are some actionable items we could potentially take?
Great question. I don't have the answer for, obviously, but just two sort of epistemic things, and we've touched on both. But I think from my perspective, they're the most important. They're the things which have most changed my sense of how things work and my willingness to engage with multiple other sides. The first is, as we've said, if only we remember that the person on the other side from ourselves in an argument is arguing from exactly the same moral imperative,
Right.
then they stay human. I don't know about you, but with elections which go not the way that you want, or in my case, after the Brexit referendum, which didn't go the way that I wanted, I was convinced that people on the other side were not just, I kind of felt that there must have been something sinister at play. Right. And you can actually, they can't really believe that. They can't really think that this is going to be better. They must be, as I said right at the beginning, intellectually inept, and morally corrupt in some way, if they haven't been paid, right? There's a sense that there's been a con at work. And actually, you look at the results of the US election right now. You've got a large part of the right that is convinced that there was fraud involved. They can't believe that the American people would be so crazy as to vote for Joe Biden. Something dodgy must be playing out here. Of course, what happened last time when it was the other way around? Absolutely the same thing. Russian interference, Facebook posts, etc. Now, not to say that there wasn't possibly Russian interference, and not to say that there also hasn't been very, very, very small instances of voter malpractice, but we're talking tiny numbers on both sides. There is no way that Russian interference in the 2016 election tipped it, and there is no way that Donald Trump did not lose this election. And yet both sides they just can't let themselves believe it. So, and what that does is that you're dehumanizing the other side. You're convinced that there's some dark work at play. There isn't. The other side is as moral as you are. They're just moral on different basis than you are. So we're profoundly human. Point one. Point two, we're all engaged in the same common project. And that fundamentally, I think, is there's two parts to that answer. The first piece is actually for society to look the way that it looks today, in which you are happily going about your business and have the freedoms that you do and the support that you do and everything else, it's actually taken a mix of political types to build. So if you're a libertarian, remind yourself that big government social progressives serve a really, really important function actually in the building out the culture, have served a really important function in building out the society in which you live. And ditto for social progressive big governments who turn around and go, actually, we need all these, we need libertarians, we need conservatives. They're part of our DNA, our cultural DNA, our group DNA, and that's fundamentally important. But that is just a realization of where we are. The bigger commitment, and this is a really tricky one, the bigger commitment is to remind ourselves that we are also engaged we need to be engaged with this idea of the loyal opposition, that the other side is fundamental for us. We're part of the same, we're building a polity that requires all of us to be involved with. If you think about the democratic template, the thing which is most democratic, the one thing that you can tell a country is not democratic for is if there's no opposition. Saudi Arabia, China. I know that they're not democratic, not because I've had an in-depth look at their legal structures and worked out that in fact the executive is distinct from the judiciary, and it's not that. It's because there's nobody else at the polls. It is the opposition which makes democracy. And therefore, that profound commitment to engaging with the opposition, to understanding them as part of our common project is just fundamental. And that's, I think, the thing which is missing. I have to say that, on the aftermath of Biden declaring victory, I've just forgotten his name, the founder of the Eurasia Group, the name will come to me in a second, tweeted something along the lines of, hey, remember, he's a liberal, remember how we felt in 2016 and how awful that was? Why don't you go and find one of your Trump supporting friends, and actually tell them that you empathize with their pain? And that you're in it together, that you're part of the same polity, you're part of the same common project. And I have to say that the responses from hard left Twitter were just hideous. It was like, why would I, when they've been, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have to get over that. And that rage and anger, that conviction that the other side isn't so much a partner as an enemy, that is what will pull democracies apart. And I'm frightened. I'm frightened about the US. I'm frightened about parts of Western Europe as well. That's exactly how democracy is broken. And democracy, whether we like it or not, as Winston Churchill said, it's the worst of all possible systems except for everything else. So let's keep it going.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think we've really gone into this us versus them mentality, and it comes down to essentially anything that we can view it with, whether it's sports and my love for, I can't remember who my tennis player is, Nadal, and then your love for Serena Williams, or the US election, or anything else. It just seems that there's been, like you said, a dehumanization of the other side when we need to, in all reality, embrace them with open arms, it seems, because they're helping craft a narrative that will ultimately help us provide something better as well. And so really working together as a team is going to be important for us to progress forward, I think is really interesting.
Here's hoping.
Absolutely. One last question I have for you, and especially now that we're moving into the holiday season, are there any last thoughts, tips, tricks, or wisdom you would like to part on our viewers on how they could get through potentially tense conversations during the holidays?
Alcohol.
Alcohol. Brilliant.
There's the very idea that I might have something wise to contribute to this discussion. I'm in my children's playroom because we're all working from home. And if my children were to hear somebody asking me for wisdom, they roll on the floor laughing. So yeah, the only answer is alcohol. And I hope everybody has a fabulous holiday season.
Yes, definitely. Well, Turi, thank you so much for being here with us today. I really appreciate it. Our viewers appreciate it. Are there any last shameless plugs you'd like to do?
Yes, shameless plug. So please join parlia.com. And also, this is absolutely true. Please reach out to me personally with anything if you want to be involved in any kind of way. We run a really successful, really funky internship program, which lasts 3 months, which gets really stuck into all the issues that we've just been talking about. So if that's of interest to our listeners, that would be amazing. My email is Turi, Turi, @parlia.com. You'll find me on the interwebs, as they say, but mostly on Twitter. And again, my Twitter handle is super simple. It's @Turi, Turi. Parlia's Twitter handle is Ask Parlia. But please get stuck in. Please reach out. I'd love to follow up with anybody. We're really excited to be talking to you. You're such a vibrant, intellectually engaged community of brilliant people. I think there's, I mean, just from our conversations, I know how much crossover there is in our approaches to conversation and freedom of speech. So it'd be great to bring you on.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you, Turi. And again, you heard him. Join Parlia, follow Turi on Twitter, send him emails if you want to get involved in the internship program. It sounds absolutely phenomenal. I wish I could be an intern again. That would be so cool. Also, if you are interested in continuing to advance the ideas of liberty, although we are still in a virtual world, please do apply for SFL's local coordinator program. Even if you're not active on campus right now, we still have a ton of opportunities to help keep you engaged in these ideas and advance freedom forward. Turi, thank you again so much for being here. It was lovely talking to you. We will be in touch. And thank you again to our viewers. Stay safe, stay healthy out there, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Liz, thanks so much for your great questions. It's been great to talk, and thank you.